Good afternoon and happy lunchtime. We're going to allow for a few moments for people to roll in. Seeing that it's 12:01, we'll give them until maybe 12:03, and then we'll go ahead and begin this webinar. We recognize that today is a very busy day, and we are competing with an extended public hearing on Senate Bill 101, one of the three state open enrollment bills. Also, please note that Kelly did drop a note in the chat that we invite you to leave your questions or thoughts in the chat as we walk through this webinar this afternoon. Kelly will be monitoring the chat for me as I will be presenting. And recognizing that it's about 12:03, I'm going to go ahead and start us on this webinar out of respect for everybody's time. I just want to begin by welcoming everybody to Reaching Higher New Hampshire's Crossover 2026. We'll be exploring the facts and the potential impacts and implications of key legislation. I want to note that regularly our policy director would be leading this overview of legislation, but we are in direct conflict today with a really important hearing in the House on Senate Bill 101, one of the many bills we're going to be touching base on today. And she is at that hearing for our team today, which means I'll be delivering the presentation on Crossover 2026. So with that framing, I just want to highlight that public schools for Reaching Higher New Hampshire, as well as many of you, are an essential public good, and they thrive when they are well supported by our communities and our state. It is this deep belief that drives Reaching Higher New Hampshire and really drives our engine. We come to the table today with conviction that this dialogue is more important now than ever. We are grateful for the opportunity to share our work and our deep belief in public education, hoping it will continue to grow momentum in support of our communities, students, and families, as well as legislation that is supportive of our public schools and our communities. I want to orient you all a bit to the agenda today as we have outlined it as a team. This is a high-level overview of the legislative session and where we are now at the critical point of crossover. We're going to offer you all an overview of key themes that the Reaching Higher team has been monitoring. I'm going to tee up a summary of some essential bills that folks need to be aware of as they transition over to a new house. We're going to dig into some of the impacts and implications of these key bills. And one of the key topics of the session, and as I've already highlighted today, is open enrollment, which is Senate Bill 101. So we're going to take a deeper dive into that as Reaching Higher has recently released some additional content. And then we're going to offer an opportunity to engage in questions and answers. But before I get into that key legislation, I really want to anchor our conversation in who Reaching Higher is, what we believe, and what we do. We are a public education policy resource center. We really pride ourselves on the nonpartisan research that we publish to support others to engage in the policy making process. Um, we believe that strong public schools benefit a community as a whole, not just the students and families they serve directly, but they also serve as a direct benefit of our state. Um, public schools bring value beyond the education that they deliver to our students. Over 90% of our students in the state of New Hampshire are currently enrolled in public education. They play a critical role to thriving communities and our local economies. Um, and they help students reach their full potential. So, all that our team does and all that our organization does is really anchored in these strong beliefs and these principles. And we really value ourselves as serving as a resource for others. We've been around for about 10 years. Those of you who have been following us since the inception or even more recently probably noticed some changes to how we publish materials and under what titles. So I do want to take a moment just to highlight some of our key work that dials all of you into our policy work and the legislative session. We send out regular email updates about the legislative session itself. That's the New Hampshire Education Briefing. You can see there's a QR code there for you all to scan. If you're not on that email list, we encourage you to join that. This year, and new this year, you've been able to go behind the scenes at the State House as Alex Tilsley offers quick snapshots of what's happening at the State House in her notebook. We offer a policy pulse, which is what we're engaging in today, which is webinars that really bring and aim to bring people up to speed on the key issues that they need to be aware of in public education. Our director of public relations leads a column known as the Five Big Questions that really aims to spotlight the stellar and exemplar work that's happening in our school districts and happening widely across our school districts in the state. And then lastly, we have a Key Communities project that elevates local stories and local voices to inform state policy, exactly how state policy should be informed. But that brings me to really the heart of today's webinar, which is jumping into crossover and what we're tracking in the legislative session. You can see we've borrowed a nice graphic from New Futures that really explains what crossover is. I think many of our attendees are familiar with the process, but we didn't want to lean into this presentation today under that assumption. So through this graph, you can all see that when a bill begins, it starts as an LSR, a legislative service request, often simply a title only. The bill is then released. It goes to committee where it experiences a public hearing or an executive and then an executive session. Sometimes there's a second committee, like a finance committee, that it has to go through, and then it lands in the full body, whether it's the Senate or the House, for a full body vote. And that's really where we are now, where those bills that had full body votes and were successful in passing from either the Senate or the House are now crossing over to the next chamber. So if it was a House bill, it's crossing over to the Senate. And if it was a Senate bill, it is crossing over to the House. And then again, it goes through the whole process of committee, public hearing, executive session, sometimes a second committee, a full body vote. If the same version of the bill passes both houses, then it can go to the governor's desk and the governor can take action. If a different version of the bill is passed, then it goes to a committee of conference where differences are resolved. And we can go into these details further at another date. update, but I really just wanted to walk folks through where we are. So essentially, we are at the halfway point of the legislative session. Crossover really marks that we're dealing with a significantly smaller volume of bills. So many bills have been killed, so they do not cross over. And really, we're managing only those bills that passed their chamber of origin and are now moving to the next chamber. So, with that orientation to where we are in the legislative session and the significance of crossover, I really want to highlight some key themes and what you all need to know so far before we dig into some of the details related to specific policy efforts. And so, some key takeaways at this midpoint of the legislative session is first, the legislature is not looking to increase K-12 funding this year and has publicly, very publicly signaled disagreement with the New Hampshire State Supreme Court rulings over school funding and the adequate funding of a public education for our students here in New Hampshire. Further, the Education Freedom Account, or New Hampshire statewide school voucher program, will not be facing any additional oversight requirements or academic accountability requirements. There were several efforts, I think up to 13 this session, to place guardrails on that program, and all of those efforts failed. Several bills would have added administrative reporting or governance requirements for teachers and administrators this session. We're seeing some of those move forward and some of them failed. And a number of proposals this legislative session, and we've routinely reported on this, did not receive debate on the House floor. And then lastly, and this is really a trend that we observed last session as well, is that public testimony and opinion has had limited impact on the fate of many bills this session. And I'm going to speak to some specific bills where we can see that playing out. It is important to note that this webinar, we're sharing a very high-level overview that offers an important snapshot of the session. We're always here for folks if they have additional questions or want to dig into further policy items. But with that general sort of introduction and key takeaways, I'd like to take a moment to really highlight the themes that Reaching Higher tracks for. And we've really organized our legislation into 5 buckets. It's important to note that there are over 350 education-related bills this session, and it's just impossible to track all those bills. So we organize the bills into buckets or themes and then tier them accordingly. And by and large, I'm reporting or speaking to Tier 1 and Tier 2 bills for Reaching Higher New Hampshire as an organization on this webinar. So school funding is a really important category for us. It's a category that we've really tracked since the inception of our organization. School vouchers and open enrollment are 2 critically important topics that Reaching Higher has done really deep research and analysis on. And what I mean by research is pulling in research from other states and also becoming expert on the policies that are being proposed here in New Hampshire. Another bucket we're tracking is really an infringement on local control. So really efforts to remove local decision-making and local authority away from towns and cities and local governing bodies. And then importantly, the category of teaching and learning and bills that really advance high quality teaching and high quality learning in our state's public school system. So I'll be walking you through each of these buckets or themes and teeing up specific bills that I'd like to talk about today. So we're going to begin with a bill spotlight on education funding. And I also want us to note that, in these slides, I'm teeing up three school funding bills here. There are far more than three school funding bills, but this is really intended to give a treetops overview to folks of what legislation is looking like this session, what the fate of that legislation is, and most importantly, what is moving forward. So I want to begin with House Bill 1815. This is a bill that focuses on education funding. There has been incredible press coverage on this bill. Despite overwhelming opposition, 1815 has passed both chambers of our legislative body and has already been signed by the governor. It was actually signed into law just a few days ago on March 27th and is set to take effect on May 26th. There was also a companion bill to HB 1815, which was Senate Bill 659. They were virtually the same bills. And that bill has been laid on the table given HB 1815 passed. Ultimately, HB 1815 opens the door for the legislature to provide less funding for education by limiting the state's obligation to the cost of offering an academic program. So basically, this bill sort of redefines that the state is responsible for covering the cost of academic programs, which right now is across 11 different subjects, and those 11 subjects are defined in current statute. It's not at this time entirely clear how the legislature will define the cost of an academic program. This is a key item that remains unanswered and is one of the many factors as to why it's potentially opening the door to lessen or limit the state's obligation to cover the cost. The bill also creates, and I would say, quote unquote, an integrated public education system of shared responsibility between the state and local government. So what that language does is it's potentially diverting even more responsibility to local taxpayers in public education school funding by naming this integrated public education system of shared responsibility. This bill is essentially the legislature's response to the repeated court rulings that the state does not adequately fund its public schools. The greater concern here is what consequences, whether they were intended or unintended, for schools that this bill will invite. The downshifting of costs certainly exists as we look to define what the language of academic programs means, and then this system of shared responsibility. Further, I will also highlight, and although it's not named on this slide explicitly, is another bill by Representative Ladd, HB 1121, which is titled Defining the Cost of an Adequate Education. It's important to present this bill in light of HB 1815. Because 1121 lists specific elements to include in the cost of an adequate education. It was also amended to explicitly not include school nurses. But what remains unclear is how 1121 may interact with House Bill 1815, because both of them are playing with adequacy and what sort of constitutes an adequate education, but very vague, opaque language continues to exist. So House Bill 1815 is probably one of the three most important bills that Reaching Higher will continue to monitor this legislative session, even though it's passed, because of its broad implications to school funding and the potential downshifting of costs of an adequate education to local taxpayers. I imagine we might see this bill resurface next year with potential amendments once 1815 is in statute. Another bill under the school funding formula that I want to highlight is HB 1563. And I would say a mainstay or a really important topic this legislative session has been about the cost of special education services in our public school. And this bill is relative to the special education formula. This is probably one of the most complicated bills this session, and it seeks to address really the very complicated challenge or formula related to special education. At this time, it has passed the House and is now in House Finance. And the proposal essentially does two things. First, it seeks to increase the amount of money the state contributes to special education services, specifically for students with a moderate level of need. Second, to pay for that, it decreases the amount of money the state contributes to services for students with the highest level of need. So it's sort of shifting where funding is going within the special education formula. I think also a really important note to this is this bill also requires schools to seek Medicaid reimbursement. However, there is a separate proposal or separate legislation that is actually trying to make it harder for schools to seek and retain Medicaid reimbursement. So another sort of really interesting interplay we see across two bills making their way through the legislature. The last bill I want to highlight has not received a lot of attention in the media or really in conversations in general, but I think it's a really important one. And I would categorize it as fairly sneaky. And this is House Bill 656. And what this does is it makes it cumbersome or more challenging for districts to accept federal grants. At this time, it has passed the House and it is making its way to the Senate. And while this bill does not seem like that big of a deal, it is yet another requirement on local districts if they receive a federal grant over $20,000 and if they did not include it in their budget that they had presented at their town's or community's public hearing. It is predicated on the idea that there are strings attached to federal grants that voters should be able to say no to if voters so desire or have that wish. Um, but what this does is it makes it more difficult for school districts to accept those federal funds, and they really need to be planning for those federal funds well in advance in the creation of their operating budgets and those budgets that they present to their voters. I will share that most of our districts have grants, federal grants specifically, that exceed that $20,000 threshold. So whether it's our federal entitlement grants like Title I or Title IIA, our CTE centers receive federal Perkins grants, and all of these grants tend to be larger grants that come from the federal government to our school district. So this will potentially really create a funding challenge for school districts and really another obligation that they have as they approve and design school operating budgets. So that is the bill spotlight for school funding. There are a couple of additional things that I want to highlight for viewers today, and that is as we consider the bucket of school funding, there are a couple of really important takeaways or themes. And the first thing that I want to highlight is that there has been an effort to overtly showcase through legislation and really the conversations associated with that legislation that many lawmakers want it known that they disagree with the court rulings. And this is directly evidenced through a few things. The courts giving a number for both adequacy and special ed aid, The Senate introduced two bills that would have adjusted funding to meet those obligations or those numbers, and both of those bills did die this session. So there was an attempt to propose legislation this session that really complied with the court rulings, and both of those bills were killed. While we never expected either of those bills to survive, of note, many senators wouldn't even engage with the question of how much we should spend because they wanted to make the point that they didn't like the court's ruling and didn't think the legislature should have to follow it. So that's one of two really big key takeaways for folks to be aware of as we look at school funding in the context of this legislative session specifically. Second, during the session, we've observed an interesting maneuver in the Senate where they may pass or where they did pass a bill, but then immediately tabled it because it had a direct fiscal impact. In theory, this allows the Senate, them, to pick a few fiscal impact bills to advance, so they are controlling the overall impact on the state budget. But it could also be for show, being able to say that they agreed with the idea or the general principle of a bill or agreed with the bill in theory, but didn't want to commit new spending to that bill or that effort in a non-budget year. This happened a number of times. A good example of this occurring was Senate Bill 517, which would allow school districts to raise the free school meal threshold to 200% of the federal poverty level and receive a 50% reimbursement from the state. This bill was passed by the Senate, but it was ultimately tabled. So this brings us to sort of the impact and implications within the school funding theme and within school funding legislation. And really the key impact or takeaways is that no outcome is emerging that attempts to solve New Hampshire's school funding formula, a matter that has been at the feet of our legislature for multiple decades. As a reminder, New Hampshire has the most regressive school funding formula in the nation and frequently ranks the lowest for state share of responsibility. And there are continued attempts to potentially lower that state share. This will have a direct impact on our public schools. Additionally, where we have seen efforts to expand spending, those efforts have been directed to alternative models or band-aid solutions or pathways that really do not fully address or even attempt to address the root cause of New Hampshire's challenges as it relates to public education, and that is resolving the inadequate funding of our public schools. A key example, which we will discuss later in this presentation about these alternative models, is open enrollment. There are several bills working their way through the legislature looking to establish universal open enrollment, which will add new spending, new state spending to this model, where the state legislature could have begun to incrementally address more funding within the school funding formula. And we'll start to dig into some of that later on in this webinar. But before we get to open enrollment, I want to move us to vouchers, something that Reaching Higher has covered pretty significantly over the last really 5 years, I would say. And we have two bills that we specifically want to speak to today that fall into the school voucher category. And then we're going to highlight some others that were killed or that were not successful. House Bill 1817, at first blush, people probably are wondering, why is this in the school voucher category? As it is relative to access to curricular and co-curricular courses and programs within school districts. Really, the intent of this bill is about public school access through alternative pathways. So, said like simply or more clearly, is this bill allows EFA students to access public school offerings for free if they enroll in their public school less than 50% of their learning time or less than 50% of a learning day. Interestingly, the New Hampshire Education Department maintains that there is no way to do this without violating one of their policy principles. Either the department would have to fund the student through two pathways, so they're funded through their voucher and their public school, or the public school would be required to educate a student for which it receives no money, no adequacy. Under current law, when a family accepts an education freedom account or voucher, they are opting out of the public system and receive their adequacy money to spend on options of their choosing. Given that the state adequacy dollars go to the family, adequacy is not available for the school that they may enroll in. Some schools do currently allow EFA students to enroll and to engage in certain programs, and that decision is made at the discretion of the local school and through conversations with the local school and the family that has accepted the EFA. How the costs actually play out in that model is also up to the local school and local school board. Reaching Higher has been trying to track how this is managed locally, and what we've uncovered is some charge the full cost of a program. Some school districts charge an adjusted or partial cost of a program or a course, and others, or very few, let the EFA student enroll, say, in a single course. Say the student wants to take chemistry at their local high school. They may enroll in and show up for the course in chemistry at no cost. There are really high level concerns about what this bill means for some of our higher cost programs and courses. And career and technical education has been a spotlight in this bill. Our career and technical education programs are some of our most expensive programs offered to students across the state. And it's not really clear how House Bill 1817 would interact with CTE. CTE programs are high demand, high tech, and resource dependent, which is why they are higher cost. Some can be as expensive as $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 for a program. Good examples include automotive, manufacturing, building constructions and trades, careers and education. But also of note is that our statewide CTE system is also governed by area regional agreements because not every high school has a CTE program because they're costly to run. So certain centers exist across the state, and sending districts enter area regional agreements with those CTE centers where their students can attend. So as we look at House Bill 1817, it also invites or raises questions about the role of the area regional agreement and who sort of assumes these seats first in these CTE centers. Assuming the department does not pay schools for EFA students who enroll part-time, again, defined as less than 50% of the time, the likely result of this will be an increased cost for local taxpayers that show up on their tax bills. So House Bill 1817 really is about students who are on school vouchers accessing curricular and co-curricular courses and programs on a part-time basis, and really becomes a school funding bill because those students are already receiving their adequacy dollars through the school voucher they receive. So there is no adequacy money currently available to supplement or pay the local school district that may take these students in part-time. The next bill I want to highlight is Senate Bill 581. And Senate Bill 581 aimed to remove the enrollment cap from our state's voucher program, Education Freedom Accounts. It has been sent to interim study. And the reason being is as lawmakers looked at this bill and looked at removing the eligibility cap, so the number of students who could receive a voucher in a given year, they became nervous about the price tag, the dollar amount that would add in new state spending to the state budget. We should note that this year the cap was around 10,000 students. It's a little complicated because there are priority guidelines associated with that cap, so it's actually a little bit more than 10,000 students. But that cap was reached this year, which also requires that cap to automatically increase next year to 12,500 students automatically. Again, I'll underscore the way the cap is written and managed. It is a little complicated because there are priority guidelines that enable those numbers to go over sort of that flat number of a cap, which would be 12,500 students next year. So that bill was put into interim study, and this is the second year of a biennium. So that means that bill is essentially dead. Uh, but what's important to note as I sort of highlight all these efforts, and I would say especially true for House Bill 1817, is that it is a step towards an a la carte approach to public education. And it's important to note that as we look at sort of an a la carte approach to public education, that undermines systems, that dismantles public education, and really begins to dismantle public schools because your public education or your public school is an essential public good. It delivers really important services to our communities, families, our students, and the state. And those services are not just limited to services that are received by students and families. At Reaching Higher, we like to highlight that local schools serve as places for voting, emergency management shelters, access to community events, culturally based community events. So, be it a school concert, be it a school play, or athletic events, it's really the heart of a community. And so we really encourage folks as we walk through these bills to begin to think about if public schools and public education is to be dismantled here in New Hampshire, what would be the community impact? How would your community feel if the community school was potentially lost? And then the third sort of spotlight, it's not a unique bill spotlight, but the third spotlight that I want to hit in this category of vouchers is that at least 13 EFA bills were killed this session or sent to study committee or tabled, which again, because we're in the second year of a biennium, means they are essentially dead. Most of these bills attempted to establish guardrails and protections on the school voucher program. So a high-level summary of some of these bills includes bills to add academic accountability, so statewide testing, reporting, and oversight requirements to the school voucher program. Those did not advance. The Senate also declined to advance a bill that would have removed the enrollment cap, citing concerns about costs, which I already spoke to, which was Senate Bill 581. The state this week heard a bill that would allow EFA students to take public school courses for free, provided that they did not enroll more than 50% of the time, HB 1817, which did pass. And then we had a meeting of the Oversight Committee. So that's sort of a high-level summary of school vouchers. But what I do want to dig into is some of the implications associated with these efforts, and specifically House Bill 1817. We're anticipating that it is likely that this bill would pass. And so what are the risks here? First of all, resident students could potentially risk losing seats in oversubscribed programs absent clear enrollment priorities. There are no clear enrollment priorities outlined in House Bill 1817 at this point. And so the question is, who has sort of the right of first access to curricular and co-curricular programs and courses? And is a full-time resident student at risk of losing access or a seat in a CTE program, in a popular English class, on an athletic team? And that just is left unanswered in the current language of the bill. So that is a real impact or implication of HB 1817. We're also imagining if HB 1817 passes, we'll see an increased pressure on class sizes and program capacity. It's of note that certain programs do have specific guidelines around program capacity. That is especially true in career and technical education programs where students are working with advanced technology, where sort of the type of equipment they're working with presents greater risks. So there needs to be a tighter ratio of students to educators. That is also true in sort of lab type classes that we often see in the sciences. So we do anticipate that we will see pressure to increase class sizes as more folks have access to these programs, and that'll also create scheduling complexity for our local school districts. Thirdly, and I think this is critical. Basically, what this bill is doing as written right now is it's enabling school voucher students to access courses and programs without any state funding to the school districts. So I would underscore that it's providing learning opportunities without any funding coming to the school districts to cover those learning opportunities. So essentially, school districts will be providing opportunity with no associated state funding. And then lastly, we're hearing that this is going to create greater administrative burden on our school districts, really in the enrollment process, the data tracking, attendance, and reporting. And so when we impose these new sort of programs or expectations on districts, we do see a trend that there is a greater administrative burden on those schools and districts and what they need to track and report. So the next category I'm going to move to is the category of local control. You have all probably noticed a trend that we're trying to really spotlight or highlight three bills within each of these categories or within each of these themes. Interestingly, this category of local control is kind of a hodgepodge of efforts. And I think the fact that it's a hodgepodge is part of the message or takeaway in this category. Being a hodgepodge, it's really about making it messy and confusing. And as broad themes in this category, we have seen efforts to pursue budget tax caps, partisan school board elections, making it easier for towns to withdraw from cooperative districts if they're part of a cooperative district, and SAU consolidation, along with making the superintendent role or the chief executive role in a school district an elected position. So those sort of examples really highlight this hodgepodge of topics that land in this local control category. And it really does sort of create this environment of confusion and messiness. And we've worked to try to make it as clear as possible. For the purpose of this webinar, we're going to focus on three bills that you see here. First is HB 1300. This is a budget cap or tax cap bill. It is important to note that all efforts pursuing a budget cap or tax cap have been voted down time and time again. And honestly, I have lost count of the number of times a budget cap has been voted down across the last couple of years in our legislative body. However, this notion of a budget cap has come back as a non-germane amendment to House Bill 1300. And this would require school districts to vote every 2 years on whether to institute a budget cap. This idea continues to resurface in our legislature, despite being widely unpopular across multiple legislative sessions and across communities. In fact, last year, a large number of towns on election day passed local resolutions in opposition to state-imposed budget caps. This was a clear attempt at sending a message to the legislature that localities did not want the state making decisions for them, and specifically around budget and tax caps. HB 1300 and other statewide budget cap bills aim to undermine local governance and local control. And we keep seeing it pop up in different places and in different versions. HB 1816 has a hearing today and was in response to Claremont's fiscal crisis last summer and the risk of almost not opening their schools for their students and community in the fall. What is notable here is that we may see more districts face financial crisis with the lack of funding from the state and the unpredictability within budgets due to such things as enrollment, alternative pathways, rising costs in healthcare, rising costs on fixed items, and quite honestly, the policy that our legislature has been passing over the last couple of years. What this bill does is it allows the commissioner of the Department of Education to initiate and implement a district recovery plan if a school district's financial and operational condition is deemed a financial emergency by our State Board of Education. So again, removing some local control from the school board and financial decisions made by that school board and school district around its operations. And then lastly is Senate Bill 574. And a major theme that we've been hearing about both last session and this session is about school consolidation, or whether it's school consolidation, school district consolidation, and school administrative unit consolidation. This bill establishes a commission with the Department of Education to study really the efficiency and structure of school administrative units, which are sort of the central office units that oversee the operations of school districts. And really, it's for the purpose of identifying opportunities for SAU consolidation and restructuring, as well as property tax relief. Of note, when you look at this bill, is it's establishing a formal commission as part of a legislative structure. And when we look at the membership, it appoints a single superintendent, which would be appointed by their professional association, which is the New Hampshire School Administrators Association, a single member of a local school board, again appointed by their professional association, the School Boards Association, and a single business administrator appointed by their professional association. So this is a significant commission undertaking a really big task, and really we only see 3 voices appointed to this commission that would study the issue and make recommendations around consolidation that would have significant impact on our communities, on our students, and on our families. So another attempt to explore an issue, but more importantly, make recommendations that would focus on the restructuring of school districts as we know it here in the state. So I haven't hit open enrollment yet, and our team actually debated whether we sort of place this recent piece of work coming out of Reaching Higher New Hampshire here under local control or in our deeper dive of open enrollment. We decided to land it in local enrollment or in local control because it really underscores where voters are in their communities and that they are, in fact, exercising their voices at the local level. Um, and what this map really tells you is there were local votes across the state on election day by 104 communities voting on the issue of open enrollment. And again, this topic is really complex and confusing because really what these communities were trying to do was to gain stability and predictability over their school district operating budgets. But to be able to do that, they needed to vote to become an open enrollment school and then have a vote on their ballot that indicated how many students they would let into their school districts via open enrollment and how many students they would allow to leave their district via open enrollment. So we see, as of today, 104 communities undertook that vote. 94% of them passed open enrollment policies, which really gave the community the authority to determine how open enrollment would operate in their community. So, really, a loud message around we do not want a statewide policy on open enrollment. Rather, we want these decisions to be made at the local level. And quite honestly, this is how we would expect decisions to be made in the public education system at the local level as opposed to the state level. And then you see a total of 3% of communities that voted not to pass open enrollment. There is much more information on our website about this graphic, about the individual communities itself and what it means. But we felt it was really powerful for the purposes of this webinar to highlight it as really an exercise and a showcase in local communities exercising their vote and speaking up. So that brings me, and I'm noticing the time, we're getting tight on time. That brings me to open enrollment specifically. And this is probably the biggest topic of the 2026 legislative session. And I'll remind our viewers that our policy director, along with many other people, are at the Senate Bill 101 extended public hearing today, extended from last week, because so many people have come out to speak about this bill. And we are receiving word as we're on this webinar that once again, there is an overflow room for testimony on this bill today because folks want their opinion, want their voice heard. I will also give a plug here that Reaching Higher New Hampshire has a dearth of material on open enrollment. We've been tracking this issue since last year when it first landed in legislation, and Kelly can drop some of that material in the chat so you can easily access it. You can also easily find it on our website, and we have new content that landed on our website over the weekend, and I think just yesterday, breaking down the latest amendment, and also a fiscal analysis, a new fiscal analysis on the bill. But to date, there are 3 bills that hit open enrollment, in addition to a few amendments that have landed in relation to these bills. Folks may ask, where are we now? So as we sit on this webinar, I shared there's an extended public hearing today. As of the latest amendment presented last week, funding is sort of the biggest change that is emerging in the open enrollment efforts being led by our state legislature. Rather than demanding districts send local dollars out of their community to a school district in another community, if a student chose to enroll in another school district, the new funding redirects state dollars and generates new state spending. SB 101 will likely advance through the legislative process. A companion bill we have is HB 751, which is in a committee of conference right now, which might see a similar amendment. We began the legislative session following HB 751 as we explored open enrollment. Now that attention has shifted to Senate Bill 101, but essentially we have two bills traveling sort of parallel tracks with 751 in the committee of conference. We imagine that's just going to sit in committee right now and wait until the end of May if needed. It really seems that the legislature is placing their eggs in the Senate Bill 101 basket. So that seems to be sort of their priority in advancing open enrollment. I will also add there are many changes that the new amendment proposes to the open enrollment policy. And it would not be fair for me to not acknowledge that many of the elements of the amendment actually make the open enrollment bill better. There are significant improvements, and you can see that in the content that has landed on our website. But as I said, the funding piece is the biggest piece. And then the other bill that I want to highlight under open enrollment is HB 1358. And most folks probably would not see this as first blush as an open enrollment bill. It's the Osborne bill on studying converting all public schools to chartered public schools. Such a broad change is likely to happen, but functionally, this would be another way of implementing open enrollment here in New Hampshire. 1358 is obviously an infringement on local control as well, because it's making the decision for the local public school to become a chartered public school. So this bill really lands in both categories of open enrollment and local control. But what is the impact and implications? And this slide of impact and implications is built off of the latest amendment that was presented on Senate Bill 101 last week. So essentially sending or resident districts are responsible for funding special education services in an open enrollment model. This raises questions about how districts will ensure students are getting the services they need and about the added administrative burden it'll create. One of the real unanswered questions that remains from the original proposal and in the amendment is about transportation. Transportation remains fully unaddressed. Without reliable transit solutions or funding for transportation, the open enrollment policy will deepen inequities rather than expand true access to opportunity for students. So essentially, if a student chooses to pursue open enrollment and enroll in another school district outside their resident district, that family or student is responsible for providing the transportation to that school or district. Districts can also still reject open enrollment applications off of chronic absenteeism or serious disciplinary issues. These terms still are not clearly defined. This may create the opportunity for discriminatory decisions about which students are enrolled in an open enrollment school. Critically, students who choose to stay in their resident district may face larger class sizes or cuts to program as enrollment and funding decline. So I really want to offer that this bill does nothing for students and residents who choose to stay in their resident district. In fact, it may have a negative impact on them. This bill also potentially establishes a system of common sending districts and common receiving districts. So I think what we may see is a set of destination districts emerge, and districts will still stand to lose money when they lose students. Our last category, and I'm going to rush through these quickly, noting the time and being respectful of that. Our last category is teaching and learning. The bills that affect teaching and learning And I think this is a really important takeaway for our audience, generally will not make teaching easier. The bills that have moved forward in this category are mostly hostile to teachers, assuming they're not doing their job and that they're trying to indoctrinate students, still trying to regulate school libraries and bathrooms. In complete honesty, this category of bills is making it hard to want to teach in New Hampshire. With that said, there is one bright light, Senate Bill 578, which expands access to recess through grade 8 and takes a more whole child approach to teaching and learning. And we're seeing signs, bipartisan signs, that this bill will likely pass through. Um, it specifically attempts to name or count recess as a part of instructional time. Right now, you're not allowed to count recess in instructional time, and it limits withholding of students from recess for disciplinary issues. So it's a really well-aimed bill, really looking at the overall welfare and health of a whole child. But again, I want to underscore that as we look at this teaching and learning category, most of the bills that we see fall in this category, make it harder to teach in New Hampshire. And that has some really serious impact and implications. At the beginning of March, so now last month, because today is April 4th, a recent EdWeek article published reported that for the past 3 years, teachers in the Northeast have been reporting significantly poorer morale rates than teachers in the West, Midwest, and South. And this is according to EdWeek's Research Center's annual survey process. They are asking, why are teachers in this region so miserable and disheartened? In recent years, job-related stress has leapfrogged overcompensation and salaries as the dominant concern for this region and job satisfaction. Many teachers feel like they are being set up for failure with laws, regulations, and demands that are upon them. And school leaders are saying that this is an urgent priority, both for the region and also here in New Hampshire. Reaching Higher has actually tracked similar trends, New Hampshire specific trends, in our very own educator surveys, which have now been deployed twice over the last 6 years. New Hampshire sees some of the most teacher unfriendly legislation and policy within the Northeast region that directly impacts our workforce, our students, our family, and our future pipeline of aspiring teachers. You can see our full report on our website, but it is important to note that these policies that are happening at the state level have a direct impact on the very people that we rely on the most in the education and development of our state's students, our state's youngest people. So what now? Reaching Higher New Hampshire is going to be deeply focused on open enrollment, Senate Bill 101 and House Bill 751, the school voucher policy that had a hearing yesterday, House Bill 1817, and measures that continue to undermine local control, local authority, and local decision making. And where I'd really like to end is just reminding our audience about the importance of community, and that communities are places where people can grow and thrive, and that our public education system is really the anchor to these communities. Investing in our public schools equals investing in our communities and investing in everyone. And our communities are engines for talent development. They offer quality of life and opportunities for collaboration and partnership. So I really ask people to leave the webinar today thinking about the importance of community and the role that a school plays in that community. I know we're about out of time. I just want to remind you, we're a team of three. I'm the executive director. Alex Tilsley, who's at the legislature today, is our director of policy, and Kelly Unteat, who's managing the behind the scenes of this webinar, is our director of public relations. And our emails are there, and we are easily reached via email and also phone, which is in the footprint of our emails. So I think I'll end there and check in with you, Kelly.
Hi, Nicole. So I recognize we are over time. We did get one question in the chat today, which I'm happy to pose to you so that we can answer that live. And it was relative to House Bill 656. And specifically, the questioner was curious, if you recall, this was the bill regulating whether or not districts need to go to their electorate to ask for permission to receive the federal grants of $20,000 or more. So the question here is whether a district could or should simply have a line for federal funding that is generically in the budget proposal year after year to sort of cover themselves in advance.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And that's a strategy that I have been thinking about as a former sort of assistant superintendent and working with those grants. I would agree that school districts really should be looking at their federal funding, maybe tracking sort of 3-year averages and determining what that average is and using that as a placeholder in the budget to offer that layer of sort of protection. As I said when I was presenting, a lot of federal grants exceed the $20,000 mark, and I would specifically name Title I, Title IIA, IDEA, and federal Perkins money that support CTE centers. So I think a lot of districts, most, if not all districts, receive some sort of federal grant that exceeds that $20,000 mark. And certainly the Department of Education can be a great resource here. They have a web page that maintains previous year's allocations under these federal entitlements. And I want to say it was something like the last 5 to 10 years, the last time I was on that webpage. And they do annually try to release preliminary allocations for the next year. And then a document over the summer usually comes out that documents the final allocations. But I do think that this will need to be a conversation between our state agency and, say, like our Superintendents Association and school boards to figure out what mechanisms that they can have in place that get those preliminary or anticipated allocations out earlier so that school boards can really work with them in their budgeting process, which begins really in late September, October, before March votes.
Thank you for that. And I am acknowledging we are significantly over time, but I do want to elevate one question that really represented several that we got as part of the registration process for this webinar. And I actually think it is perhaps one of the more important questions, especially given one of the themes you identified at the outset, that we're not seeing a lot of responsiveness in the legislature to public opinion and public outreach. So the question to you, Nicole, is if you could name one thing that a public education advocate or a supporter of their local public school could or should do to make sure that their elected official knows where they stand on any particular issue or public education in general, what would you suggest they do?
Yeah, so my recommendation is to keep it local. So you should be inviting those elected officials into your schools, into school board meetings, and engaging in active conversations with them about what the will of your community or what the will of the public is in that community. I think local is where everything happens. And yes, it's very important to engage in the state level and legislative process and create this record of opposition. But I think where we see real change is in the towns and in the cities that make up the state. And they're so unique too. So keeping these conversations local, really being open to having these conversations with people elected to local office, and also sharing this information with your neighbors and friends. Ultimately, it's the community that goes to the polls and elects the officials that go to the state house. So keeping it local and impacting the conversations there, I think, is most key.
Fabulous. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully, you found this all very informative. I've mentioned in the chat a few times, I will be sure to email out to everyone the recording of this webinar, as well as the slide deck and any related materials. I'll throw it back over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Kelly. I just wish everybody a great day and still encourage you to go to our website and look at the latest open enrollment content that our team pushed out.